Hello, and welcome to the Ask Me Anything about cognitive accessibility and some of the new guidance from the W3C on how to achieve cognitive accessibility. I'm Rain Michaels. I'm an interaction designer in Google's central accessibility team, and I'm also a member of what's called the COGA task force with the W3C, and that's the task force that's putting this guidance together. And I'm thrilled to be joined here today by my excellent colleagues. We'll start with Erin Buehler.
Hi there, I am Erin Buehler. I'm a user experience researcher on central accessibility with RAIN, and I focus on our cognitive research efforts.
Hi everyone, I'm Shabi Kashani, and I am a user experience designer on the central accessibility team, and I lead accessibility for design systems.
And I'm Michael Gilbert. I'm a UX researcher on the material design team, leading research on components and accessibility.
Thank you all for introducing yourselves. We're going to jump right into the very first question that we have on the dory. So Linda has asked, what does quote unquote provide alternatives for numbers mean? And why is this something that we should do? How does this impact an app or website that is entirely based on numbers, such as weather or finances-based product? I absolutely love this question. So one of the objectives is and one of the design patterns in the guidance itself is to provide alternatives to numbers. And I'm going to turn this over to Erin to talk a little bit about this from the research perspective.
Yeah, for sure. So when we're thinking about representing numbers with alternative information, we should really kind of take a step back and think about our audience. So there's a lot of different types of cognitive disabilities and differences. And within that space, we have some folks who essentially have challenges related to interpreting and applying numbers. And this can be something like dyscalculia. There's other types of moderate sort of cognitive disabilities where individuals may need assistance in kind of applying meaning behind numbers. So when you're imagining a website, you need to kind of think on, do I have to show numbers, right? So like, first of all, do we require numbers to communicate the information that this individual is going to use to complete an action? The next component is it consistent, right? So we want to make sure that anytime we're using numbers, it's consistent, units are labeled. And then once we kind of move beyond this, the way that we provide support is that we pair any numeric information with some secondary kind of information, like visual reinforcement to provide an example to help interpret that information. Pretty much any type of number that you can imagine being on a website can benefit from having this additional scaffolding. If you think about sizes or quantities, like showing pictures that help represent how this works, taking it a step further. So we want to help folks to get a sense for what the numbers mean, and then also the ability to apply that meaning from the number. A great example is this weather app that I've encountered where obviously weather is very numeric, right? You have temperatures, you have humidities, they're represented in degrees and percentages. But the critical piece of information that you want when you're checking the weather most of the time is, well, what should I wear today, right? You need to know if you need your jacket, you need to know if you need your umbrella. And so what this app does is alongside that daily temperature information, it displays a suggestion of like, oh, you should take your jacket today, or oh, it's going to rain, you need that umbrella. So that's actually taking it one step further to help that individual interpret not just, okay, it's going to be warm, but like, what do we do with that numeric information? 80 degrees is warm, warm means I should wear shorts. And so it's just a very cool example of one way that you can scaffold for these folks. But like I said, consistency, labeling, providing information in multiple channels, all super helpful and supports a wide range of different types of cognitive disabilities and differences.
Erin, I really appreciate that you added the consistency and label components to describing this as well. When it comes to things like phone numbers or dates or other sort of common numbers that people might see, we have a lot of situations in digital experiences where the designer will format them in different ways. And there are certain expectations for user input of how those numbers may actually be formatted. And that in and of itself can provide a challenge. So Shabi, I'm going to throw this to you really quickly and just see if you could add something about how to sort of format numbers or how to control formatting of numbers within a design system.
Yeah, that's a great question. So, for example, when I think of formatting numbers specifically, I think of a date picker. And typically, depending on where you live, you might input a date in various ways, right? So the system itself, so I would imagine a text field, should allow the user to input the date in the manner that they choose, or it should provide additional messaging for the user to indicate a specific manner in which you should input or format the text. And going back to the previous option, where if a user is empowered to write whichever format suits them best, so for example, writing out the actual month, or maybe the month is in the middle of the date, the system can reformat and should reformat the date so that it is inclusive to all users, and it fully writes out the month itself, so that anyone coming to this date picker isn't confused as to which number represents the month, which number represents the date, and users also won't have to be so wary about putting in the wrong date. And you can also consider other methods of formatting text as well. So rather than having to actually explicitly type out the date, maybe this date picker just allows the user to select a date from the dialogue itself.
That's a great addition, and also speaks a bit to another one of the objectives in the guidance itself, which is the objective of supporting adaptation and user personalization. Let's move on to the next question that we have here from Braden. I love this question as well. So the question is, what does it mean to, quote, provide multiple ways to understand content? And how can this be built into a pattern within a design system? This is great. This is a two-part question, and I'll take the first part, and then I'm going to throw it over to Shabi and Michael from the material design perspective and the design system perspective. So the first part of this question is providing multiple ways to understand content. Erin already spoke a little bit to what this means by describing the weather app, where if you're providing information such as a number, such as a temperature, for example, what the individual really needs from that is they need to understand how they can apply that information in their day. If they're a gardener, they need to know how much water their plants are going to need. If they're wondering what to wear, they need to know what to wear. So they really need to know the temperature in terms of its context in their lives. And if we simply provide that information through one method, then we're only reaching those people who most effectively understand that particular method, or who kind of engage with content in a very specific way. Some people will find it easier to understand information visually. Some people are visual learners, and they will look for icons or illustrations to help them comprehend the information in front of them. Other people are far more comfortable with text. And even some people are more comfortable hearing the text, where other people are more comfortable visualizing it. So finding ways to allow people to access your information through whatever modality is most comfortable to them and is going to best support their comprehension is really important. The other piece of this is making sure that each of those bits supplements the other, rather than being kind of in contrast to each other, or having one sort of be abstract and not actually supplementing the other. There are also people who, from a cognitive perspective, need to see the illustration and read the text at the same time in order to understand what they're looking at. The two together is what creates and enforces that comprehension. So with all of that being said, Shabi and then Michael, if you have some tips on how people can actually build this kind of support into a design system so that people can regularly implement it, that would be fantastic.
Yeah, of course. Thank you so much, Rain. This is a really great question. And as you mentioned, it's really about using a combination of modalities for each component within your design system. So this could be supporting imagery, color, messaging, and even sound design in some cases. But you want to marry a few of these together within your design system and components. And when I mentioned sound design, you could think of when you're talking to the assistant, for example, and the system lights up and then also has an ear con to inform you that there is a confirmation that the system is listening or the query has been heard. In terms of a design system in 2D material, think about your placement and hierarchy and the overall layout, which can help aid in understanding content. So when people land on your website, for example, they may skim from top to bottom. And so if you were to use a component such as a banner, you could help inform users of changes that may happen down below. And with the banner, you could employ color, an icon, and messaging, which would further support understanding of any changes that users will encounter below. And if you have long articles, for example, you could also provide videos that summarize highlights. But within your video player, you want to ensure that you're always providing closed captioning. And if this is not possible, then you should at least have a transcript for users to understand the video contents. And then lastly, design systems are standardized. However, you should always consider how you could allow for personalization within this design system. So material design is now looking into colors that suit you and material you. You also, going back to the previous example, when you have an interface that has a substantial amount of text, you could provide a reader view to limit any distractions within the experience. And then also going a step further could be your design system has a few different fonts that you allow users to choose from. So enabling them to customize their font so that you can support readers who may have dyslexia and therefore support a more usable experience. I'm curious what you think, Michael.
Yeah, excuse me. I think I'll start with the easy response. So how can we build this into a pattern within a design system? I might say start with the COGA guidelines and start by just making sure that you're familiar with those guidelines, familiar with the existing guidance that is part of the W3C, and then just making sure if you're working on a design system like I'm on material design, make sure that you understand who the audience of that design system is. Make sure that you understand the users of the products that are going to be built with that design system, and to the greatest extent possible, try and spend some time with them. Without trying to suggest that any method is necessarily perfect. Try and just make sure that you're across the table, or nowadays virtually across the table, to understand what their needs are, what their concerns are. And then you can, maybe better situate what it means to provide multiple ways to understand content, given the specific product, the specific design system, and the specific context that you're trying to understand. And so that's potentially how I would start to answer the question. I think this is great because we could go on all day. Of course we can't, but yeah, no, that's where I would begin.
Thank you, Michael. And actually that leads in very nicely to this next question that we have here from Mike. So let's move on to that one. Some of the stories and patterns in the COGA guidance refer to implied content. What is implied content, and how do we build ways to provide explanations for it into our websites, apps, and other digital experiences? This question is a really nice follow-on to the previous question in terms of providing multiple ways to understand content. So, and I'm going to go ahead and take this one. Whenever we build visual stories, especially, but also sort of sound stories or any kind of experience, and an application or a website is a visual story that's giving the user something to get information from. But when we build these visual stories, into these stories, we add things like imagery of people's faces reacting to what's in the content. And things like that imagery of a person's face is in and of itself implied content, because the person having a reaction may have a facial expression that we feel has meaning, that is important for the person sort of consuming our content to receive. whether you're sort of indicating that this is an error page and you show a person who's confused. Well, that illustration of the confused person is in and of itself implied content, because only people who have the ability to truly understand facial expressions will actually understand what that look of confusion actually means and how it supports where they're located. So if there's not an explanation for them, maybe a caption or a little thought bubble above their head to help reinforce that confusion, you are leaving some of your users out of the experience. Another area where implied content can be kind of really fuzzy and difficult to kind of understand or move away from is when we're asking people to fill out a form, and we might ask them to answer a question on some kind of a continuum where we'll say, you know, with this particular question, do you feel strongly, very strongly, somewhere in between? Maybe you have kind of a 10-point scale that you're asking for. And there are some individuals who have certain developmental or cognitive disabilities that can make it really difficult for them to kind of think of things with that level of sort of a continuum. And I'm going to actually go to a personal example for this, which is my own son, who is autistic. And for him, if you ask him, what is your favorite something, or you know, what's something that you like, it's actually very difficult for him to answer that question, because he really only has two categories of things. He has the categories of things that he likes, and he has everything else. So if you ask him, you know, did you like you know, how did you feel about the taste of this particular item? You know, where would you rate it on this form that we've given you? He can't really do that. All he can say to you is he either liked it or he didn't like it. And this really came into play and comes into play often for us when we're answering medical forms for our son. So it had a serious impact on us in his early years with ear infections, because for him, he wasn't necessarily experiencing pain until he was experiencing extreme pain. So he never answered those sort of, well, how much pain are you in on a level of 1 to 10 questions accurately enough for his pediatrician to recognize that we actually needed to bring him in for a check. And so we would end up at the doctor for an ear infection at the point at which it was very serious, not in the early stages when you want to catch it. So these are some of the things that you can kind of think about when you're thinking about implied content and how you create your interfaces, that there are people for whom that kind of spectrum thinking is very difficult. And binary questions will be far easier for them to answer. We're sort of thinking about scoping your questions so that you're asking people about a very specific time and place and not kind of asking them to think on a very general level. Erin, would you like to add anything to that? I know that you've done a lot of research in the area of binaries and spectrum.
Yeah, so I mean, I think there's a lot that we could potentially unpack there. I don't want to spend a whole lot of time on just the one question, but a couple of things. So when we're thinking about this, we're essentially talking about people's capacity to use their sensory input and their perception to sort of infer something, right, from this implied content, from these scales with the binary versus the spectrum thinking. And this is one of those spaces where this can be part of interface design, especially if you're asking people to rate something. Have you ever seen those like user satisfaction surveys and things like this? Or if someone is giving a thumbs up or a thumbs down, individuals might actually need some additional reinforcement to understand what the association is between that like action or that option in the interface and the implied like, this is how you feel about this thing, or other people will see this thing. And the other place, I don't know if we'll get any questions about this, but the other space that this is really crucial for any of my researchers in the audience is when you're conducting research with folks with cognitive disabilities and differences. So when you are asking people, like on a scale from 1 to 5, how much is this, you know, awesome versus not awesome? I'll choose my language wisely because we're live. You might actually need to pair this with some different options depending on that person's communication profile. They might be more comfortable choosing between 2 options, like Rain was speaking to the binary thinking, or it might be easier for them to describe something or point to something to give you a sense of how they're feeling about it, and not necessarily having them pick from this really structured, like, you know, sort of Likert scale system. So I think I'm going to stop myself there, but I have lots of thoughts about that. And if any researchers in the audience want to ask more questions about research with cognitive disabilities, you put them in the dory, please.
Yeah, I love that you ended there with sort of circling back to multiple ways to understand content and sort of reinforcing what that means on the scale with some other input mechanism. Let's go on to this question that we have here from Jamie. Jamie's asking, if a site creates separate versions, one that prioritizes branding because it's part of a product, and another that follows accessibility guidelines, are there additional considerations and technical signals necessary to prevent search engines from viewing the AAA version as duplicate content? For anyone who's less familiar with the guidelines and the overall WCAG accessibility guidelines, I just want to clarify that AAA means the WCAG guidelines at level AAA, which is the most stringent accessibility level, and it's not typically AAA is really kind of the gold standard that you might try to reach, but most of the time organizations will aim for something more like AA because that's more attainable. And sometimes accessibility guidelines can actually be kind of in conflict with each other depending on the needs of your user. So that kind of goes back to Michael's early point: know your user, know who you're building for, and what they're going to need. But let's sort of try to take the first step of this answer, and then I'm actually going to turn it over to Michael as part of the material team to try to maybe tackle this a little bit further. But what I'd like to start out with is just kind of advocating for the accessibility community on the whole. If you're actually providing two separate experiences, what you're doing is kind of creating a separate, but you're kind of following the concept of separate but equal, which can mean that some people can really feel left out. And in general, the disability community is in and of itself a really large market that, probably approximately 1 in 4 people has a disability that they sort of consider in their lives right now. And pretty much everyone in their lives at some point will experience a disability. So I would start by kind of urging you to consider how your branding can still shine through in an accessible product rather than trying to create and maintain two separate products. Michael, do you want to add anything, though, on the other aspect of this with the technical considerations?
Well, I actually think that your response was spot on. So I'd +1 that. I think that it's one of those things where I think that sometimes it is difficult to make sure that everything is perfectly accessible. Some of the guidelines can be challenging, but even with that said, I think that it's very much it's a worthwhile goal to ensure that you're building something that is accessible. I think it's also a doable goal. It's achievable. And then beyond that, I think it's also achievable while still maintaining a very clear and understandable brand presence. I don't think the two need to be mutually exclusive. And so I would certainly land on, basically reestablishing that as a design aspiration, and then suggesting that there are tools both in WCAG, both in material, and beyond that can hopefully allow you to move towards that in an effective way. As a just additional caution, I'd say that just the sound of maintaining multiple tech stacks or design stacks in order to have multiple sites that are going to be, the content will literally be duplicated across the both of them. Just for the sake of engineers and designers, it seems like trying to simplify that might be beneficial for internal people as well as your product's users. But yeah, just to once again echo Reen's comments. I think it's a reasonable and achievable goal to have something that is accessible, beautiful, and brand clear.
So we're going to move on to the next question. I want to try to get as many of these as we can. Larry has asked, with the wide range of cognitive disabilities, how does one code websites and apps to address this diversity of users? And wow, that's a wonderful question. Erin, in a moment, I'm going to turn this over to you to talk about user research with the population. But I'm just going to start out by addressing that, yes, there is a really wide range of cognitive disabilities. There are a lot of different cognitive needs. And then there are also some cognitive challenges that people experience that aren't related to necessarily specific cognitive disabilities. So what the COGA guidelines, what the WCAG COGA guidelines, guidance is trying to do is, instead of focusing on the diagnosis or the actual disability itself, is instead to focus on what is that kind of area of cognitive need that needs to be supported. So is somebody having challenges right now with working memory? Are they having difficulty kind of keeping in mind what steps they're going to need to do next? And if that's the case, how can we sort of support that individual with those steps in the experience itself? So I'm kind of going back to what Michael said early on. So start with that COGA guidance, start with that massive document, which begins with user stories and kind of objectives of how to carry somebody through that experience, regardless of what their cognitive weaknesses and also their cognitive strengths. And I think it's also important to recognize that we do have different strengths that we can lean on as well, even when we have certain areas that are difficult for us. But Erin, you probably have a lot to say on doing research with the population. If you can maybe spend 2 minutes talking quickly about that.
Yeah, so I think, it's a super valid question. Question asker was Larry, correct? Yeah.
Yep.
Larry. Thank you, Larry. So it's a valid question, right? This is a very heterogeneous space in terms of cognitive disabilities and differences. You can have folks who have impacts related to working memory, their capacity to do planning, like future planning and processing, attention. Like there's all these different areas that are part of our capacity to function cognitively. And so when we think about this, like, just kind of echoing what Rain was saying, if we're looking at these different sort of user stories, these different populations, and we're kind of doing a best effort approach to designing for these cases where users need this extra support or this extra scaffolding, and then we just generalize this to good design practices, it elevates the experience across the board. So you don't necessarily have to pick just one set of folks and say, okay, I'm going to make my application or my website work for people with intellectual and developmental disabilities only, right? Because the principles can be generalized, helping people to focus, helping to guide attention, helping people to not be so reliant on memory. These are all things that support a very intersectional amount of cognitive accessibility. So that's like my first little hot take on this. Regarding the research, like also just doing research with folks with cognitive differences and disabilities is really crucial to actually building those apps and websites. There's really nothing better than getting to see how a person is interpreting your interface elements. What is the sequence of steps that they're taking in their interaction? Like, are you correctly accounting for the way that they're interpreting that interface? And by doing this more inclusive research where you're actually touching base, not just with folks with cognitive differences, but as I said, like intersectionally, differences in ability, socioeconomic differences, differences in technology literacy, for example. If you're actually doing research with users in these spaces where they live, understanding how they're interacting with technology, you're actually much more likely to find these sort of considerations and design needs that elevate everybody's experience. What I like to say about cognitive accessibility is that you can have situational, temporary, and permanent disabilities, right? And so for anyone who's ever been a new parent, there's a really good chance if you're staying up with a baby that you have a temporary cognitive disability related to the amount of sleep you've been getting that's impacting your working memory, maybe your emotional regulation, and a couple of other things. So working with these kind of populations that are perceived to be sort of edge cases actually elevates the design and the implementation across the board.
Thank you for that, Erin. And we're going to close out with a question here from Hoyan, which is really related to everything that Erin just said. How do I design for situations where a person without any impairment in their regular life become temporarily impaired? And really, just by thinking about these populations and thinking about the various sort of cognitive functions that we rely on, and scaffolding those within your designs is going to be the way that you're going to design for everyone and bring everyone into the experiences. And, Michael really nailed it early on when he said, start with the guidance that's up on the W3C site, the new guidance. There are some excellent user stories in there that people worked hard on before I even joined the task force, and they can really help you think about how to build your products. Thank you so much for joining us. We're thrilled that you're here, and find us in the sandbox if you can, and we'll answer more questions.